This is Oral Rehab Lecture 15. Lecture 15 is an overview of cochlear implants and aligns with the slide set, Lecture 15 slide set. And in Lecture 15, it'll take a couple of parts to kind of get through. Some of the material has been pretty much just cut and pasted from the various cochlear implant manufacturers. So they make for really awful slides in terms of presentation, but it's just chock full of information. Generally said, I would want to encourage you to take a look at the three cochlear implant manufacturers that are authorized to sell cochlear implants in the United States. Most all of them have a wide range of therapy materials available, some of which you can appropriate for non-cochlear implant patients, because a lot of it is just teaching speech kinds of concepts. So there's a rich resource for you in many ways that you may not anticipate. Again, if we think about it, one of the main aspects of cochlear implants is to try to help children to hear and ultimately to speak. So it's in their very best interest to try to help individuals such as speech-language pathologists, teachers of the deaf, auditory verbal therapists, and so on, to help them to achieve those goals simultaneously. So let's move on through these through the slide sets. Cochlear implant is an electronic device which has some, but not all of its components are surgically implanted. In fact, most of the brains of the outfit are really exteriorized. As we go through the parts here, I'll show you a little bit more sort of how that kind of aligns. In the United States, cochlear implants are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, so you can go to fda.gov and you can kind of see more about it about there. But it is a regulated medical device, in part because it requires a surgical implantation. In the United States, there's three manufacturers that are approved by FDA. Cochlear Corporation, Med-El, and Advanced Bionics. Of the three, Advanced Bionics is a local endeavor. And in that regard, Advanced Bionics originally, I'm not sure if they still are, were manufactured in Sylmar, California. I think their main offices now, worldwide, I believe, are in Valencia, California, up in the Santa Clarita Valley. So Advanced Bionics is a local, for all intents and purposes, a local group, but worldwide company. When we look at the cochlear implant here relative to the different parts and such, this is kind of a view looking through the skull. So it's, again, most of these things I've just appropriated from the manufacturers. So again, what you see out here is you see an exterior part that sort of looks like a hearing aid. This part over here looks like a hearing aid. And then there's a wire that attaches to an external sort of digital transmitter device. The skin of the skull is in between, so this is the skull and the skin, and underneath the skin is the receiver of the signal. So the idea is that sound goes in there, gets changed into an electrical signal, goes up the wire, and gets sent out this way, goes through the skin, and then this little guy back in here picks it up and sends it along its wire, and ultimately up and into the cochlea, in through there. And this is kind of a blow up of the other end of the cochlear implant down there. This is the electrode array. So really, when we look at this and we kind of see what's in fact implanted in the person, is really just the materials of the receiver part over here, a wire that runs through the middle ear, as you can see, into the round window, and then the electrode array, which then is pushed into the bends of the cochlea. Here's a picture kind of showing you again on X-ray sort of what it would look like. So this is the implanted part over there. Sorry about that. This is the implanted part here, and again, it's designed so that this part sits over that spot. But again, the skin of the skull is in between. This is held to that by magnetic attraction. So it's got to be, again, just strong enough to be able to stay on the skull here without head turns and things like that, but yet not so strong that it would sort of rough up the skin that's in between this part and this part over here. We used to think that cochlear implants were primarily a pediatric application, but not so much anymore. Here's one fun-loving old gal over here that is showing how much she loves life with a convertible and so on. And here's her. Wow, look at that, I'm color-coded even. Here's her cochlear implant in place. And so one of the major sort of changes, at least in my view, over the last, 10, 15 years in terms of cochlear implantation has been a greater, this may be the wrong word, maybe it's the right word, greater marketing to adults who have had very limited success and or benefits with hearing aid amplification. So adults with severe to profound hearing loss, poor word recognition. And again, if these are adults that have had a hearing loss in adulthood, or post-lingual hearing loss, and they're getting limited benefit from hearing aid amplification and are otherwise okay for cochlear implant, then they seem to do pretty well with it. Again, it's part of a restoration of acoustic the acoustic world to them. So more and more, even as an audiologist, I'll get marketing things from different medical groups and different large ENT surgical groups saying, send your adults to us for cochlear implantation. And again, here's sort of the same concept here, but kind of viewed in on a child. So again, the basic idea is if we look at the basic sort of this part that kind of looks like a hearing aid, fundamentally this is a computer. There's a microphone here that takes sound into the computer. The computer then changes it into an electrical code and then sends it along the wire to this electromagnetic transmitter, and again, under the skin sends it to the other part that's under the skin, and then ultimately into the cochlea. But you can kind of see it there in place. And again, unlike our fun-loving senior who's got the color-coded, sort of the, actually, if you notice, I just never even noticed it. The color here is the same as her color of her little moo-moo or whatever she's wearing there. And so here we got one that's sort of a darker color that sort of aligns with the hair color, and it's a little more inconspicuous, as generally said. Some basic facts of cochlear implant. Again, generally said, we have to consider both adult and pediatric applications, but we can consider cochlear implant when a person is not getting any benefit from a basic hearing aid. So one of the general rules, I guess, so to speak, is that if a person can function and do well with a hearing aid, they're going to be better off than with a cochlear implant. So I guess one of the sort of implicit candidacy issues would be, how much benefit does a person get from a hearing aid? If they get none or very limited, then okay, cochlear implant may be something to consider, amongst other things. One thing to sort of note about the function of cochlear implant is that really, the cochlear implant really, I like this terminology better, is it's really kind of a cochlear bypass. You'll see it when we look at how the thing is wired up. But the basic idea with the cochlear implant is what's really implanted is a wire that emits electrical impulses. That's what's implanted. If you think about what the function of the cochlea is, the function of the cochlea is to transduce energy into a neural electrical code. At the point at which the cochlea is receiving energy, it's receiving energy in sort of hydraulic or fluid-driven waves that are analogs of the acoustic signal in the environment. So there's multiple transductions that occur prior to the energy wave arriving at the cochlea. But once it arrives at the cochlea, the output of the cochlea is an electrical signal. So however you choose to think about it, whatever energy that's an analog of the whatever energy that arrives at the cochlea is an analog of the acoustic signal. That analog gets converted into an electrical code that now is created by the firings of the primary auditory sensory cells, the hair cells, and for the most part, the hair cells that are contributory to this are going to be the inner hair cells, are going to contribute 90% of the afferent information into the auditory system, into the auditory nerve, and with only 10% coming from the outer hair cells. So the function of creating the electrical code falls to the hair cells in the cochlea. Well, when we think about what a cochlear implant is, we're not putting a device in the cochlea that does that. we're putting in a wire that's attached to a device that does that, but it's doing it on the outside of the body. So the external processor that's worn mostly now at ear level, the computer that takes that air conducted signal in and converts it into an electrical code, that's really the cochlea. That's really the proxy for the cochlea. And then that electrical signal then travels along the wire, and then it emits the electrical signals along an approximate to the auditory nerve, and stimulates the auditory nerve at appropriate segments of the auditory nerve in the cochlea. So, to me, that's how I sort of consider it. Is that it's a bypass in terms of the function. The function is really exteriorized. The cochlear implant stimulates the auditory nerve. So you have to have, implicit in this is that you have to have an auditory nerve that's intact, in place, and is a viable auditory nerve. If you don't have an auditory nerve, cochlear implant's not going to work. Nerve impulses then travel, again, if the cochlear implant stimulates the auditory nerve, the nerve impulses that are now dropped on the auditory nerve, they travel to the brain via the auditory nervous system. And so again, much as the implicit need for the auditory nerve, you now also have to have an intact auditory nervous system pathway. And so again, that just means that certain types of disorders, certain types of diseases are not going to be amenable to cochlear implants, because it could well be that part of the system has been severed. For example, if you have a significant auditory nerve problem, the auditory nerve might have been sacrificed or severed as part of a removal of a tumor on the auditory nerve. So the conventional cochlear implant would not be a viable opportunity. Cochlear implant capitalizes on the organization of the auditory system referred to as tonotopic organization. Tono means frequency, topic means location. So what this simply means is that the information in the inner ear is arrayed according to frequency, from low frequency to high frequency, much like a piano keyboard has the same frequency to place relationship. Piano keyboard is a tonotopically organized device. So too is from a receptive point of view is the inner ear, and really all of the processing central nervous system nuclei in the central auditory nervous system, including the brain. So the brain is laid out spatially. So there's the brain tissue that's responsible for frequency, in effect, is laid out much like a piano keyboard, in the sense that there's a region that responds to low frequency, a region that responds to progressively higher frequencies, until we have both ends of the frequency range kind of mapped out. Again, from a point of view of how the brain processes information, the brain has to take information from the various sensory receptors, which can only really code things in terms of numbers of firings and the rapidity of firings, and then has to make sense out of it based on where those rapid or relatively slower firings are delivered to the brain. So the spatial organization is true really for all sensory modalities. The same thing is sort of true for the visual system, and really for all sensory modalities, that firing rate, the speed of the rapidity of it generally denotes the amplitude of the response, how much, how loud it is, so to speak. But the frequency content is really determined by the brain based on the spatial array, the actual organization of the tissue from one spot to another. And again, think of it as sort of a miniature kind of piano keyboard in that regard. Again, what I just sort of outlined to you here is just another slide that I sort of like, which again shows over here really more is the focus on more the internal parts. The external parts is shown over here. So again, the real cochlea, so to speak, is contained in this thing that looks like a hearing aid, but microphone, computer, processor, and a wire that delivers it to the transmitter that sends a signal through the skull. And again, underneath the skin is the implant processor receiver that then sends basically a wire down, and you can kind of see the wire as it kind of goes, exposed in the middle ear into the round window of the inner ear, on the wall, on the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. And then the electrode array, which you can kind of see these little dots here, as the electrode is then pushed into the cochlea. The cochlea in humans, typical humans, has 2.5 turns. So here we've got 1 turn, here we've got a 2nd turn, and then here's our half turn. So we got 2.5 turns in the typical human cochlea. And so again, usually they try to have something that gets about, they never really get all 2.5 turns, but as you can see here, they've got 1 and then another half, so 1.5 turns is a typical placement there. When we look at, again, the parts of the cochlear implant is divided basically into the external parts, sound processor, which has the microphone and the computer, and then the internal parts, which has the implanted parts, the receiver, and then the electrode array, which is inserted then into the cochlea itself. When we look at the parts, again, here is what's surgically implanted, and again, this is the part that magnetically attaches. Yikes! Here's the part that magnetically attaches. This part magnetically attaches to the skin to this, and then here's the electrode array kind of going down through here. Here's a ground, and then here's the part that goes into the cochlea. So this is 2.5 turns, that 1.5 turn right there. External processor over here, and then sort of a controller as far as that goes. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is over here is a body-worn type device. I thought this was like a remote control, but it's not. So these two are in effect equal, but this just has a different placement. More and more, it's the ear level is what's favored. This is reminiscent of a slide that I borrowed from Nancy Ty Murray that you saw in Lecture 8. And the main difference here is that the acoustic signal comes in, is converted to an electrical signal, and now goes to a speech processor. Well, a speech processor is just a fancy word for a computer. And at that point, then an electrical signal comes out of this and goes to the transmitter. So unlike a hearing aid where even if this was a digital processor, it would, at this stage here, would get reconverted back into an acoustic signal. But here it doesn't. You can kind of see with the square waves is trying to imply that everything now is an electrical signal at this point. Again, other thing to note is that the processor is really a little computer. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to really try to go through this, so I just gave you some different colors just to kind of break it up. But the basic idea here is in thinking of the cochlear implants, again, from the MED-EL site. They've got all kinds of videos, by the way. All these companies have videos and all kinds of really attractive materials. And again, this kind of talks about how it works again, and it's really not that different than what I talked about just a moment ago. But the basic idea is that the electrical signal that's traveling along the wire that goes and ends in the cochlea basically stimulates whatever nerve fibers are there, which then use the intact auditory nervous system to deliver that signal to the brain. You got to remember that hearing is something that happens at your brain. And in the absence of a functioning auditory system, this is a system that provides an alternate input of the electrical signals into the auditory nervous system. That's basically the beauty of it. I'm going to adjourn at this point, and we'll go to part 2.